Thank you so much for joining us, if you just joined, or for continuing with us. Next, we will have the second talk of today, the second and last talk. So I'm very happy to introduce Professor Vladimir PINHEIRO Safatle, who is a full professor in the Department of Philosophy and the Institute of Psychology at the University of São Paulo. Also, of course, one of our writing residence fellows for the month of December. And he will be speaking about nature can only exist where it is destroyed, politically constructing freedom as heteronomy without servitude. So thank you so much, Vladimir, for joining us, and please go ahead.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you so much for all the participants, and I'm very glad to be part of it. I will just present something that I'm developing here at the Institute, and I hope that we will be finished until the end of the month. And I would like to start actually quoting one constitution, one article in the Ecuadorian Constitution, the Article 71. This article, it states, I quote, "Nature, or Pachamama, in which life is reproduced and realized, has the right to full respect for its existence, as well as the right to the preservation and regeneration of its vital cycles, structures, functions, and evolutionary process." Well, this was the first time that nature had been recognized as a subject of rights in a constitution. Resulting from a continuous series of indigenous popular struggles, this constitutional provision pointed to something much greater than the consolidation of a legal innovation capable of providing more instruments of action for those seeking ways to regulate capitalist extractivism. It was, in its own way, an expression of the political awareness that the modern concept of nature was the fruit of dichotomies rooted in a metaphysics in action that had to be destroyed. The brutality of extractivism, with its combination of progress and destruction, would be impossible without the social acceptance of these dichotomies in their legal normative existence. Integrating nature into the horizon of what we recognize as subject had nothing to do with animistic archives or messianic mysticism. Rather, we were confronted with the awareness that a fundamental change could occur from the moment that nature was no longer socially experienced as a system of things to be used, no longer understood as an object. For this legal innovation tended to produce a collapse in the way we define what can be used and what cannot be used, what is endowed with agency and what is not, what is a thing and what is a person, what can be property and what cannot be property. Must legally recognized agency necessarily take the form of the will? And what about the vital cycles that produce agency because they unfold process, structures, and functions that are open to chance and contingence, even if not exactly in the form of the will? Shouldn't we give them the dignity of subjects too? Well, I raise this example and these questions to argue that a fundamental task of contemporary critical thought is to help the process of destroying nature. The current crisis calls not for a new alliance with nature, but for a new destruction of nature. Not the physical destruction that we are seeing more and more dramatically, but the destruction of the system of dichotomies that animates our metaphysics, especially the metaphysical distinction between humans and things that has guided our hegemonic relationship with nature. A distinction that is not secondary in our system of thought. but central, because it constitutes what we understand by us. For the West, it's not really a form of society. It's primarily a form of nature, or a way of defining the living system that affects us and in which we participate as nature. It is by inventing something like nature, with its internal tensions and categories, that we have created our Western societies. It is the defining concept of our ways of life, albeit in opposition. For where nature defines the rhythm of movement, there can be no history for us. Where nature defines behavior, there can be no self-determination. Where nature defines cycles, there can be no freedom. But I would insist that the system of crises that characterize our time is the inescapable consequence of this way of constructing nature. This perhaps explains why nature has become the name of a crisis, or to be more precise, the point of convergence of an articulate sequence of 6 crises: ecological crisis, demographic, social-economic crisis, political, psychic crisis, and epistemic crisis. This crisis, each in its own way, indicates the exhaustion of the values and normative horizons that for centuries seem to guarantee the path of our emancipation and freedom. Progress, development, abundance, prosperity, growth. These concepts are charged with a profound normative dimension because they seem to guarantee the material condition for emancipation. And all these concepts are deeply linked to the faith we have given to nature, to our understanding of the kind of relationship we should have with it, the distance we should keep from it. If I had more time, I would like to unfold a certain genealogy of nature, at the roots of which we see the notion of self-government, self-legislation, in other words, autonomy constructed through the understanding that servitude is any action produced by a external causality to us, or causality external to us. Our rational image requires a clear ontological distinction between human exceptionality and the affection produced in us by the rest of the living system. The system must not affect us in the sense of something that caused my action, that provides the impetus for my decision. Self-government presupposes a de-affection, a profound de-implication in relation to a nature that was initially seen as a hostile space. And this space must therefore be recomposed from my own image. It must become an extension of my image, as if it were a matter of subjugating it, of overcoming its strangeness. This can only happen if nature becomes a space for the exercise of human labor, as if its destiny were to become the object of human labor. And let's remember how this idea appears at the beginning of capitalism. Let's remember, for example, John Locke, Second Treatise of Government. Without the earth and all lower creatures are common to all men, every man still has property in his own person. No one has any right to it except himself. It can be said that the work of his body and the work of his hands are properly his. Whatever he takes from the estate that nature has provided and left, there is mixed with his work, becoming something that belongs to him and therefore making it his property. Well, this is a crucial text for understanding the hegemonic notion of freedom among us and its social consequence. Locke says that individual freedom is a question of self-ownership, of being the owner of one's own person. But let's look at the second point in this passage. Property is a way in which the individual relates to himself and to the world. For property is above all an affect, the affect of the security of things that are completely subject to my dominion, of things that have lost their strangeness. And this can only happen when nature is subjected to labor. But should we ask what it means by labor in this context? For Locke believes that our space in which nature has not yet been subjected to labor, multiple space in which we would find the meat of virgin nature, of empty and unworked space, of a land very close to nothing, ready to be taken over and colonized. In other words, the technodiversity of multiple social forms, but must be radically denied. The same technodiversity that develops in many cases without the need to distinguish between domestic space and wild space, between the space of nature and the action of culture, where the space of production is discrete in continuity with the general space, because it ignores the extractive logic linked to primitive accumulation. In other words, if Locke is a victim of this illusion of lands untouched by labor, it's because his concept of labor is organically and exclusively linked to the capitalist production of value. This production has to break what the young Marx called the metabolism between man, human, and nature in order to reduce nature to a condition for the valorization of value and a justification for colonial expansion. But I would like to remind us that we are no longer in this historical moment of the first liberalism and its aims to labor and progress. In fact, it would be more interesting to remember how, at the beginning of the 70s of the last century, reports appeared showing the collapse of such notion of progress. One of them, perhaps the best known at this time, was called exactly The Limits to Growth by Dennis Meadow, Donella Meadow, and Jorgen Anders. Reports like that warned that the concept of progress, organized development of our societies, would end in disaster, or if we want to be more precise, in what we might call the disaster of exponential growth in a world of finite resource. Exponential growth is a common process in biological, financial, and many other systems around the world. This was the kind of sentence we could read in this report mentioned above. And this gives rise to the idea of something inevitable, a force that should be regulated, but not denied altogether. Nevertheless, it is possible to criticize this notion of exponential growth as if it were a biological factor. It would be possible to understand the very notion of exponential growth as a social aberration, rather than the expression of a natural principle. For we must remember that exponential growth is a reality that depends entirely on a certain, very specific type of society, which is subject to the process of generating surplus and the exponential expansion of consumption. Around the same time, at the beginning of the 70s, Etienne Ballas, in a book on China entitled The Heavenly Bureaucracy, recalled that China had all the technological and scientific condition to invent capitalism in the 13th century. If it didn't, it was partly because the state closed the mines when the metal reserves were sufficient. In other words, they lacked the notion of exponential growth as the continuous extraction of surplus value. This exponential growth, when it appears, will be inseparable from the development of even larger world markets, colonial subjugation, the exploitation of working conditions, the use of unpaid labor, with all the violence that this entails. This explains why epochs seen as historical moments of technical improvement and human perfectibility have been understood by others as a moment of catastrophe, dispossession, and destruction. What it seems as exponential growth for some means continuous destruction for others, a war against them, against their knowledge and their modes of production. When the Brazilian economist Celso Furtado read the limits to growth, he couldn't help but point out another thing, namely that the report unwittingly showed that the pattern of development and consumption of the central countries of capitalism could not be generalized to the whole world, which showed that progress and economic development were basically a myth. There never was and never could be progress for all, and I quote Furtado. Limits to growth clearly demonstrates that the lifestyle created by industrial capitalism will always be the privilege of a minority. The cost of this lifestyle, in terms of the degradation of the physical world, is so high that any attempt to generalize it would lead to the necessary collapse of the entire civilization, endangering the survival of the human species. Then we have clear evidence that economic development, the idea that poor people can one day enjoy the lifestyles of the today's rich people, is simply unattainable. We know uncontrovertibly that the economies of the periphery will never be developed in the same sense of being similar to the economies at the center of the capitalist system. In other words, progress, as we know, it did not depend solely on the violence of exploitation and conquest. It turned out to be an unattainable myth beyond very strict geographical limits. And for this reason, the most consistent way to get rid of this myth begins with denying progress, no longer trying to turn a blind eye to its violent metrics, recovering what it destroyed, questioning the metaphysical distinctions on which it was based. But I would like to finish insisting on a point that is often overlooked in this debate. If the notion of progress has been so closely linked to the idea of dominating nature, of disenchanting it through calculation, measurement, and quantification, of being able to organize forecasts that would immunize us against scarcity, of controlling the involuntary and the contingent, it is because the desire for progress has always been based on the fear of being confronted with force that we cannot control, that threaten our self-preservation. In other words, progress has always been the fruit of fear, which is why it can and must be so violent. And in these ironic reversals of history, what was done in the name of self-preservation now threatens our own self-preservation. In other words, by compulsively trying to ensure our self-preservation, we are creating a process of self-destruction. Getting rid of this fear would be a necessary condition for progress to finally begin, for us to realize Theodor Adorno's beautiful prediction: progress begins only where it ends. For this would mean that we could no longer justify violence against everything that appears to us as insubmissive, involuntary, and contingent. The ecological crisis, a crisis in the relationship between society and nature, will always be accompanied by what we might call a psychic crisis. Overcoming it requires not only a negation of economic development and its myths, but also a negation of the kind of subject we've become. There can be no ecological pact without something like another psychic pact. The violence we do to nature has never been separated from the violence we do to that which is not the image of maturity in us, to that which appears as nature in us. Finally, this shows us that the critical destruction of nature will not be done in order to regain some lost ontological security, but rather not to be afraid of what is a heteronomous force around us and within us. And for this reason, I'd like to conclude by reminding you that social struggles aimed at questioning the place that nature has hitherto occupied among us bring with them the possibility of reconstituting the libidinal and psychic horizon that underlies both our idea of identity and freedom, two values on which our hegemonic forms of life are based. These social struggles are struggles that articulate politics and metaphysics in an innovative way, because they understand the political and economic consequence of modifying the metaphysics in action that guides our process of social rationalization and institutional construction. Generalizing the concept of the subject to what has hitherto been understood as an object, as something of lesser value and secondary purpose, means recognizing that we are concerned and that we can see ourselves in what does not bear our image, in what is heteronomous to us. I'm free. To be free means admitting that not only do we act, but we are acted upon by other subjects who are not exactly like us, which will end up changing what exactly we means by ourselves. For this brings us to the beginning of a different idea of freedom, not more freedom as a self-legislation, which implies a strong identity between self and nomos, and a strong rejection of what isn't the image of nomos in me, but freedom as the ability not to be affected by fear, as the openness to external causalities, freedom as heteronomy without servitude. There is no deeper and more effective political transformation than this. Well, thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much. Wonderful. So we have some time for questions, of course. Yes, Sadi.
Apologies for starting again, because this is a very deep one, Vladimir. And so it's complicated to ask questions. And I guess my colleagues are still trying to digest what you came up with, because you're raising the very question of who we are and where we're going in contrast or in cooperation with what we call nature, but that is the rest. And so the problem, as we all know, is that our desire to survive, our conatus, has destroyed our nature, our environment, our ecosystem. And I'd like to come to these three terms because I think they're really interesting. So you started your title with this idea that you are where you can be destroyed. And I think that's Merleau-Ponty who came up with this, right? And this is really deep, because this really creates the notion of what are the limits of myself. And this is exactly the problem that we're tackling here, is when we're destroying the environment, we're destroying ourselves. But the way we have defined nature as something else, first put it as an object, and as an object, as you said, of labor and production. And so that was something that was another. So in the way we act as beings and humans, we are allowed to use objects for our own purpose, right? And then came this notion that it's not us versus it, but it's us versus the environment. And we came to this notion of nature becoming the environment. So this is a perception of what's out there in relation to us. And so at least there is this relation of dependency in a way. And the final one now that we are becoming aware of is the notion of ecosystem. So we are part of this. And perhaps this is really important, because we cannot have the us versus them. We cannot not have this exploitative approach on something that is ourselves. And so if we understand that we are where we can be destroyed, and that we are part of this ecosystem, then suddenly if we do something bad to the ecosystem, we're destroying ourselves. And therefore, perhaps we have this conatus playing in the right direction, that we should not harm the system, because if we want to survive, we have to not harm ourselves. So the way I think you set up the problem in ontological terms is, if we manage to make people understand in the way we talk about nature and the environment that we actually talk about ourselves, perhaps we can have an awareness that we have to be really careful about this, because we're harming ourselves when we harm the ecosystem. But so we should teach kids to understand the ecosystem as a part of ourselves and not as something that can be exploited. So that could limit perhaps a little bit our destructive approach to this.
Oh, thank you so much, Sadi. Actually, you are totally right. These are the points. I would like just to insist on some questions. The first one is, well, I tried and I would like to develop this a little bit more, to insist in this connection, this necessary connection between politics and metaphysics. And I would like to insist in this point, but using the concrete configuration of some social struggles. And for me, it's very striking to see, especially in Latin America, these types of struggles that put into question the social place of nature, what exactly we should understand by it. This is the reason that I try to begin with this constitutional change in Ecuador, where nature was defined as a subject of right. And I think that this is not just, let's say, some art. This is absolutely not just some archaic recuperation of a certain animistic notion of, in the bad sense, notion of nature. But I think this is a very precise political strategy with a strong consequence, because I agree to you that there is a reconstruction of the idea of ourselves that should be an object, not just of education, but also an object of social struggles and constitutional and legal and chains, institutional chains. And I would like to end insisting that, well, these change will oblige us to rethink what we understand by freedom. I think this is the point that for me it's very important. Means this idea of freedom as the law that I give to myself, this freedom as self-legislation, of self-government. There is a strong political, theological, political genealogy, and I think this is this should appear as a kind of structure for social emancipation, but I think that is a kind of structure of social servitude. And one of the responsibles for this type of relationship of nature that we have developed in our hegemonic forms of life, then I think that there is a philosophical, let's say, and also a political task concerning the reconstruction, not just in ideas, but in acts and social struggles of the notion of freedom.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Next, Isabel.
Hello, hello, Vladimir. I have two questions, and thank you very much. Thank you very much for this very strong, strong presentation. My first question has to do with the fact that you seem to, in a sense, identify or translate concepts into affects, classical concepts into affects. I'm thinking of freedom that you defined in terms of affect, the Lockean freedom you defined into affect. And I was also thinking of how you describe progress into the affect of fear. First of all, am I right about this translation? Could you say a little more about the strategy that leads you to such a translation or such an identification? And my second question, if I may, to pick up on the question that you were just asked, I was wondering whether you think it is enough to convince ourselves of the fact that when destroying nature, we tend to self-destroy ourselves in a sense. Is it enough for us not to go on harming ourselves in harming nature? Those are my two questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Isabel. Well, about the first question, I would say, yes, you're totally right. I think that every political concept has a kind of as a kind of presupposition a structure of affect. Then I would say it is not possible for us, for example, to think progress without, let's say, this presupposition of a fear that is present in this idea of the necessity to dominate nature, to subjugate nature. And I would like to stress for, let's say, the genealogy of this affect, where this came from. This came not from just, let's say, which are the material conditions for a certain notion of abundance, a certain notion of development that is proper to capitalist society, but it's also, let's say, there is also a theological presupposition concerning what we should understand by, let's say, by reason and by a will that is a free will, a will that is it's not submitted to some external power. And I think these things can close together, and maybe one way to evaluate and one way to understand it is insisting in this affective structure that is present in our use of certain concepts. This is for the first point. But the second point, you are totally right. It's not just a question of convince ourselves that, well, we are part of a broader systems of relationship that's not just intersubjective relationships, but also relationships with what we understood until now by objects and by things and things like that. And these things have a power of action. I think it's not just a question to convince people, but it's especially a question of identify in the social struggles, in the concrete social struggles, where this type of question is put into problematization. Where I think that a task for a critical thought is not, let's say, to just say what are the normative grounds that we should attain. But I think the task is a very different one, is to identify in the concrete struggles what are their, let's say, their potentialities. What they really can produce, what it puts in question in that, and then I think, of course, there is a function of the intellectual, let's say, thinking that it's not just to connect itself with these struggles, but to give a broader possibility to development.
Thank you.
Great. Any other questions? No? All right. So if there aren't any more questions, thank you so much, Vladimir, for joining us. Thank you so much to everyone as well.